Welcome to the 8th episode of PortfolioCast. Today we're speaking with Edward Goodchild. At his heart, Ed is an enthusiastic innovator and a perennial entrepreneur. On top of building the Zendht Venture Studio, he is an independent advisor, board chair, forum moderator, and charity trustee. Welcome, Edward.
Thank you very much indeed for having me.
No problem. So let's get started. Your love for innovation is a clear driver in the work that you do with Zendht. Where was that passion first formulated?
Well, it's interesting you should ask, because I think if you'd asked either my parents or my schoolmasters, or indeed my friends when I was in my 20s, you'd have never marked me down for doing any of this. I have to give away an age now. I'm now in my mid-50s. It started when it was probably a bit of a midlife crisis when in my mid-40s. And I'd been an advisor for a long time. And the bit that I found really interesting about the advice was hearing the life stories of the people that I was advising, private clients. They were all entrepreneurs. They'd all typically started with zero and had made a significant amount of capital. And I started thinking, well, if they can do it, I've got these sort of connections and advantages, well, then surely I can do it. So that's what I did.
Fantastic. I mean, it's interesting that you say going back towards school, you definitely wouldn't have been seen to do these sorts of things, but you've definitely got a clear appetite for learning. You mentioned that you have been an advisor, you're a chartered wealth manager, you've got your CISI fellowship, and most recently, you've just this year gained your Chartered Institute of Marketing fellowship. So congratulations on that. How has all of these different educational avenues helped you build your portfolio career as it stands today?
The reason it's worked, or the reason I pursued these different channels, is it's only relatively recently. In fact, having it as a portfolio actually finally gives it some sort of overall coherence. Because before I've done a whole series of different jobs in lots of different arenas. And therefore I've sought to be qualified in whatever I've been doing. And it's now that I knit it all together. I call it my venture studio because I've got a number of different businesses. But you could equally describe it as a portfolio of different interests. And it's being able to be open-minded to picking out new knowledge about lots of different things. And I make a comment lots of times about reach and range and scope and opportunity, but really it's about looking up and out. And education is just part of it. I suppose I'm endlessly curious and I'm just sort of kind of follow things or get interested in things or just develop passions about things.
I think that's one of the biggest traits of portfolio professionals is this curiosity. And it's interesting that there can be lots of fear in the different types of work that you're going to be taking on or the challenges, etc. But actually there's not that fear of finding something out for the first time or trying something for the first time and seeing what happens. That curiosity definitely drives us, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, in order to promote yourself, or to get somebody to pay you to do something, you need to have sufficient information. You need to have sufficient experience, which is why probably coming at it a bit later in life rather than kind of straight out of uni probably makes it easier. But people come to ask your advice because they don't know the answer. So you clearly need to know more than they do, because otherwise, why would they listen to you or pay you? But it doesn't mean you need to know absolutely everything about everything. And I think it's the fear of thinking there are gaps in your knowledge that hold people back from doing multiple things or taking the big brave step. I think it was Branson who said, if your plans or your ideas don't frighten you, then they're not big enough. So you've got to have a little bit of nervous anticipation. I think one of the characteristics, and I know it of myself, you have to be somebody who's sort of permanently fidgeting. You're always after new things or kind of wanting to look round the corner or look over the wall. You have to be slightly kind of nosy about life in general.
Yeah, absolutely. It's having the curiosity about the shiny new things and the focus to actually complete something with them.
Yeah, it's interesting because somebody else was on a talk I was listening to and said, well, of course, it is the sort of the trope that comes out. Well, everybody's got ideas. It's all about delivery. Yes, it is about delivery, because otherwise it's not a business. It's just a book of ideas. But I actually don't think that everybody is full of ideas. But like lots of things, I think you can learn to have ideas. Yeah. I don't think it's naturally this sort of nature or nurture. I don't think it's that some people just have an innate right to have the ideas and other people don't. I think you can nurture and encourage it and learn the behaviors, and you hang out with the right people, you go look for it in the right places. And then guess what? If you're open-minded to it, then you pick up and run with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you explain how you work with all your multiple roles of keeping your eyes and ears open and alert to the world at large. Heads up, not heads down. I really love that phrase. We'd often talk about balance in these interviews, but what I'd really love to know more about is how you make the connection between all the things that you do and how that benefits you and the people that you're working with and others.
The starting point is I push back against this whole idea about work-life balance. The way that I look out the window, as it were, is I've got a life.
Yeah.
And life is more interesting if it's got some complexity, or it's got some narrative around it, or it's got some extra interest rather than being kind of monolithic, just doing one thing. I'm a bit of a sucker for joining things. And that's probably because I've never been a sportsman. So the whole kind of go play golf, go play rugby, go play cricket, go play anything else has never been part of. I've got a background of joining membership organizations and wanting to be kind of an enthusiast about things. And then if you go off and do that and you're open-minded, you meet other people doing other things and then how they relate. I suppose the way that I glue it together, and it's always a bit imperfect. There's no, in this sort of mosaic, there are very few hard lines. There are lots of dotted lines and connections. The starting point, and I suppose it's sort of life values route. Life's pretty good if you go around being helpful and, broadly speaking, kind to people. And if you are broadly speaking kind, so somebody needs a helping hand, you help them, then you suddenly find that actually other people help you. I actually view it as a safety net. There's a whole bunch of comments about integrity is how somebody behaves when nobody else is looking. But actually, if you go around and try and just be a reasonable human being, it's amazing how many other people then treat you that way. But that is actually really the glue that sticks it together. So you read, I don't know, let's make it as a digital example. Somebody pops up something on LinkedIn and says, does anybody know somebody somewhere? Either you do know somebody or just have a scroll around. I did it earlier on the week. Scroll around for that company. Do you know somebody who's a second or third connection? Ting their name in. It costs you nothing. You try to help somebody else. You create goodwill. Guess what? He suddenly comes back X days later and that's what makes the world go round.
I'm a huge believer in paying it forward and having that open-mindedness of going into conversations not about what can I get from this, but what can I give.
But it's also an added part, if you're on the business founder route, is that tends to be fairly self-centric because it's your drive, it's your determination. You ultimately are the decision maker. It all ends up at one desk, which is do we or don't we? That's quite an insular outcome. I spent a bit of time as a peacetime soldier, so nothing dangerous, but this idea of collegiate responsibility and obligation and responsibility being the two sides of the same coin. So if you end up with this sort of potential isolation, then I like doing the pro bono things because it's teamwork. And as I just said, I don't do team sports, never been able to catch a ball in my life. And therefore it's a proxy for that, because if you sit on a charity board, for example, you are one amongst many rather than being the leader who has to make the final decision. And the balance of the two, I think, is a pleasant way to live your life. There's a whole ton of stuff out at the moment, obviously, about mental well-being and where's my place in society and what do I do, and all I ever do is work. It just gives a little bit of balance to a life, I suppose.
It does always end up coming round that way, doesn't it? There's many entrepreneurial professionals out there. We're definitely seeing them come out of the woodwork even more now, so that people are facing furlough or redundancy, etc., and who are looking to a portfolio career as a springboard into starting their own businesses. What advice would you give to somebody who is on this path?
Well, I'll give us all three bits of advice. The first one is in one's own headspace. So, and I talked about it a few moments ago about this sort of kind of isolation factor. I've worked in large organizations, and one of the really things that's difficult then when you step off on your own is you're on your own.
Yeah.
And you kind of think that you were the kind of leader in it, and suddenly you learn all sorts of new skills, like how does your router work? How does all your IT work? Telephony? How do you set up email accounts? All of this sort of kind of hits as a wash. So the advice there is you want to create pretty quickly a little black book of technical people who can help you get stuff done. The second one is a recognition, again, in headspace, that nobody really cares what you've done before. So you need to develop your own narrative, because that's what people will remember. You want people to be talking about you, so you better set your own story, because otherwise it's just a sort of kind of random walk in the park. I set up my first business when I was made redundant. So I'm sitting nicely in a house and 2 kids in school, and I'm just sitting looking at a box of possessions. Yeah. I didn't see it coming, by the way. So that changes your risk appetite, because you now have the scope for starting something up. And I was fortunate there was a redundancy payment, so that gives you a bit of money to start with. So that takes off the immediate pressure. But I was always kind of a bit embarrassed about that. And then you realize after a few years that lots and lots and lots of people who've set up companies, quite often the starting point has been the redundancy. And people who've gone on to set up really successful big companies are quite open about it, which is part of the reason I'm now talking about it. The follow on the next part is, I was always under the impression you needed to have a really detailed business plan. You needed to have everything topped and tailed and everything to the state of perfection. Back to an old military adage that the first casualty of war is the plan. I think actually this sort of agile working, you need to have a sense of direction and what you want to try and achieve, and then break it down into the various steps to try and get there. But you need it to be kind of fluid, because, and the pandemic certainly proved this, life just throws a whole ton of curveballs at you. Even when the world's being well behaved, it throws curveballs at you. And actually, probably the differentiator of a successful entrepreneur or somebody with a portfolio career is the ability to be able to cope with that uncertainty. One of the things I've said to lots of people, and it applies to me, is you're never going to have a day when your jobs list, your task list, you're going to have ticked everything off. So if your criteria for being able to walk away from your desk, have a good night's sleep, go out for supper, all of these things is that I've got a completely clear desk, you'll be chained to your desk for perpetuity. You never get away. Yeah. And therefore the skill, which often isn't the case in very large organizations, is being pretty brutal about prioritizing. This absolutely has to be done. Right, better do that. Tax return, yes. It'd be nice to talk, and you have to permanently sift about what really needs to be done. But you can only know what really needs to be done if you have a very, very clear identity of where you want to be. And the struggle, and indeed Portfolio Collective have been really cool about this, is helping people work out what their goal should be. Yeah. Because otherwise it's just a bit of a random walk, and it might work and it might not, but I'm a bit too much of a control freak. I'd like to know. It's a bit like sat-nav. You have to stab in the postcode. You may get lost on the way and you change the route and all the other stuff, but if you don't have this clear vision, then it's harder.
Yeah, knowing the B, where you're going towards, is definitely a helpful starting place. As you say, it's a big part of what we do, and it's a big part of how we start our catapult course, for example, just getting people to really focus. And often people haven't taken the time to do that, and it might be because they haven't been allowed the time to do it. How have you approached starting new businesses? You've started many and you continue to work with many. How do you go about thinking, right, okay, is this a good idea or a bad idea?
Well, I have a very simple process, because that's the sort of way I work. So the first one is you just have to have the idea. You don't need to have sold sort of kind of nuclear fusion with this. It is just an idea. Then I normally write what I would refer to as a scoping paper. So get some thoughts down on paper, normally a couple of sides of A4, bash it out. Don't worry too much about syntax, just bash it out, and then move it around. Then I normally try and literally sketch it out as a picture. Probably started because my kids are a bit older, so they'd all done A-levels and stuff, but a sort of kind of mind map thing. It's a doodle, basically, because you're trying to work out how all the different bits hold on together. Oh, if I do this, I can do that, or there's a dotted line. Oh, I know somebody who does that. So you're beginning to create a kind of an ecosystem around it. Then typically I go and look for people who can help me. They might be employees, they might be collaborators, they might be freelancers. Don't really mind, actually. I'm quite neutral. And that's normally done on a basic skills matrix. I know where I want to go. These are the skills that I need. These are the things I definitely don't know about. It's a bit of self-awareness about, oh, no, there's no chance I can do those. Right, I need to find somebody who's got some of these skills. Or then there's, well, I could do, but it'd be much more efficient if somebody else did it. So it's sort of comparative economics 101. I mean, you do it at top level on boards about board members and the skills needed and put little X's in. Well, you do the same in your own head. Then you've got to try and scoop those people up to your idea. So that's your first pitch. Because if all the people you approach go, nah, well, then you need to go back in the office or the back bedroom and scratch your head and think, well, okay, maybe it wasn't quite so cool, but there's an iterative process. But as long as they don't laugh you out completely, then there's normally the part about trying to find some money. I mean, basically you've got two options, your own back pocket or somebody else's back pocket. So there's always a bit of tension about that. Mm. And of course, the amount of money that you have then determines the path that you can take, and 10,000 different models of doing that. I have generally gone the bootstrapping model because I've been enthusiastic about what I want to do and I'd rather just get on with it. Because the really ugly side of fundraising is you go and talk to 100 people and 95 of those people will tell you you're wrong, misplaced, somebody else is doing it. Because you've got to find the 5 that will back you, let's say. And if you don't really can do it bootstrapping, my advice is do it because you don't get diluted. You don't have the problem of tons of people telling your idea is rubbish. Now, there's a difference between genuine feedback from people who want to engage with you. But when you're out being the supplicant wanting money, it gets really soul-destroying when people say no. So if you can avoid just going and seeing them at all, then my advice is just skirt around it. Try and work out a different way of doing it.
Yeah.
It's normally talked about you go and talk to friends and family. I actually think that's the hardest people to talk to.
You've kind of got people who are completely unbiased or biased in a completely different way.
But also, they tend to be less hesitant about giving you full feedback. And then, of course, you've got the idea, you've scoped it out, you've got the team, and then you need to start making it happen.
Yeah. Obviously, you run businesses, but also you have roles within other organisations, etc. And particularly being a board member of several different companies, we've talked about the fact that that allows you to have some give back, some play within the roles, a slightly different role to everything landing on your plate, being part of a team. But what advice would you give to people who are looking to expand their experience in getting involved with other companies?
Give it a go. Mm-hmm. It's hard though, because generally it's much more straightforward to pick up pro bono. So what you find is you end up being really, really busy and you got no income.
Yep.
And depending on your personal circumstances, that's either a good thing or a bad thing, which is part of the reason that trustee boards, for example, tend to be people who are all retired because the money's kind of sorted. If on the other hand, you're still working, then there's a quotient of my time that I like to give back in pro bono philanthropy, all the rest of it. By the way, the philanthropy part is time and effort. It's not to do with money, but it's trying to facilitate and help and guide and judge. There's a part which is in sort of family and pleasure and life. Then there's new business and business activities, things that I've generated. And then there's always a sort of the 10% that's unallocated because you need to have a float if you want to do other things. And I generally, rule of thumb, work on the premise, if I'm taking a new thing in one of those categories, then normally you've got to give up one. Now, I then tend to wrap that in good governance and say, well, if I'm going to take an appointment for something, 3 years, maybe with a 2-year extension. I've got into trouble on a couple of different ways because I say, look, I'll take it if there's a clear way that I can find my replacement. Or actually, what I jokingly say is after about 4 years, you need to sack me because otherwise it becomes a perpetuity. That's not good for them. It's not good for me.
There's a really interesting and honest way of looking at it, and also an honest conversation to have at the start, I guess. And not many people are used to having those kind of honest conversations right at the beginning, like this is what I want to achieve out of it, and this is my expectations. But that's a really important conversation to have.
Yeah, I just think it's an open, transparent one. So we were talking about clear objectives for business. I would contend you ought to have kind of broadly the same thing for your life, of which business is either a small part or a large part or whatever proportion you want. But if that general planning works for business, well, then I also think it applies to life as well. One of the things that I would encourage anybody who's stepping out from an organization into a portfolio career is the real value of mentors and coaches. My general steer is and pay for it, because it's really worth it. So I spent quite a lot of time really pre the Zendht Venture Studio idea, which is really coalescing all the things that I'm involved to try and give it a coherence and structure. Because they are all interrelated, and quite often people tell me, oh, you're doing too many things and you can't possibly, and how does it work? So ultimately, a bit like I was talking about drawing out the doodle. Well, I've now turned it into a website so somebody can see what I do. So hopefully that demonstrates the coherence. And they go, okay, I understand what he's doing. But part of that is having a really clear goal. And I have a number of sessions with a really great coach. And I have it as my singular objective, what I refer to as long-term financial equilibrium. That's different for everybody. It does come down to a number, but the number comes down to, well, why is that number? Because I need or want to be able to achieve these goals. In order to do that, the machinery needs to produce that. It gives you a timeline. It's not quite a cash flow forecast, but it's got elements of that. Yeah. And therefore, if that's the direction I want to go in, well, then these are the things I need to do to have a pretty high probability of being able to hit it.
That's really good advice. And I think that's certainly something that a lot of all-stage portfolio professionals need to remind themselves of, is kind of having that end goal. Most businesses have an exit strategy. What is your exit strategy of your career? You know, what do you want to achieve at the end of the day? It's a blasé way of putting it, or a rather clinical way of putting it, maybe. But yeah, it's an interesting thought to have and apply to how you should.
You see, one of the pushback, again, I push back on this idea about having an exit strategy. I suppose because I spend 10, 12 years as a portfolio manager, so picking stocks, building portfolio. It's not predicated on an exit. It's predicated on producing something that can continue to create new businesses, but the starting factor isn't selling any of them. Now, like all entrepreneurs, if somebody comes around the corner and offers you a ridiculous price for something, you think it's worth 10 and they offer you 1,000. Yeah, you bite their arm off. Notwithstanding that as a sort of the outlier event. The way that I constructed it is to build and hold, not looking to sell anything. The discipline, the financial discipline, is to build it such that it could be sold, because that keeps all the ducks lined up and everything working properly. But one of the bits I really push back against as a kind of common prevailing culture is you have an idea, you kind of throw lots of money at it, it has a sudden rise in value, and you flog it off to somebody else. No, I rather like the idea of building a portfolio of businesses.
You know, the way that you have created your businesses, it is passion-led. It is your interests to, fluffy away. They're your babies. They're part of what you've
created. They're not my babies. They're my angry teenagers. Don't trust me.
I did have, in one of our previous podcasts, actually spoke to somebody who described their children as their startups, because they literally are behaving like startups, and they're toddlers. Like, you've got to put a lot of work in, etc., etc. And the analogy went on. So it's nice to hear your business being angry teenagers. We talk a lot about success and what it means, and obviously that's tied up in what we were just talking about, in whether we hold on to our businesses, whether we hold on to our roles that we have, or we develop, or we have cut-off periods for different things, etc. Success is obviously very important to what we do, what it means, how it changes as we go through our careers. But I think talking about failure is just as important. And there is all these stats in the world about how such and such number of startups fail, and et cetera, et cetera. You've got to get through the first 3 years or 5 years or blah. What failures have helped you along your way? And do you see them as failures anymore?
Oh, the way is littered with failure. I can't tell you the number of things I've been massively unsuccessful in, and all sorts of things that you thought were going to be a bright idea and had ended up in cul-de-sac. Through nobody's particular fault. They just have. So I'm just in the process of, it is launched now, Deputy Finance as a property finance platform. So the basic problem it's seeking to solve, we don't need to worry about it here, is a long-term persistent problem. And this is the 5th way that I've tried to solve it. Now, this one will work. will work. But actually it'll work because its predecessors shouldn't have worked. Yeah. So, for example, as we begin the marketing for it and somebody says, well, why is it like that? You go, well, because we tried the other ways and they didn't work. And because we're lessons we learned. So, for example, this is about bringing private capital into the gap between what the bank will provide to a residential developer and what the developer's got. And there's always a gap. So you can try it as a fund. But then nobody wants to do blind pool investing because they want to be able to touch it. So that didn't work. I thought I could do something called a reverse loan note, in that you raise a bond and then you do onward lending. But anybody who puts money in wants to know where it's going to go. So that didn't work. I tried to do it as a simple introducer to a finance broker, but that didn't work because unless they completed the deal, I didn't get paid. So I had no control over it. But this is this iterative process. Yep. The risk of doing it in startup land is it all tends to be a bit public. But you can't do it all in the laboratory. You just have to get out and go and do it. Yeah, no, I think you have to willingly embrace failure. And you also don't let it do your head in. It is just part of it. In fact, I would contend that the measure of an entrepreneur is how you deal with failure.
Yeah.
Dealing with success is really easy. Happy days. That's great. It's when it's going wobbly or it's going wrong. B, can you stay calm? Because there's normally a way out. Secondly, can you keep your team together? Because everybody's under different pressures. There's a unifying factor of success, but if that tips into failure, can you keep people with you?
Yeah.
Much harder. But the joy is, if you can, well, then you go around the block again. But what it does mean in your construct of how you put your portfolio together is to have some things that are really low risk. So if you are a global equity portfolio manager, you have some high risk ideas that got really high returns, but they potentially got higher. But you also have some really boring things at the bottom that just sort of kind of pay the bills. And actually in business, you need a bit of that as well, particularly if you're following the portfolio route. So actually a couple of things where you do your day's work, you get your day's pay, that's fine. Mortgage is covered, can eat and drink, you're okay, is probably pretty key.
Yeah, and that's why a lot of people, and certainly my experience of it, was starting off with paid PAYE jobs and then building side hustles and then taking a leap with one or many of them.
It doesn't need to be this kind of black or white. It can be a process. It's not that hard and fast. Again, to go back to something I mentioned before, this cultural shift. If you've had a full-time job, doesn't matter what level in what industry, that's the thing you've done. And that breeds a certain degree of certainty. And it's having the right attitude to be able to cope with this fluid movement of lots of different things happening at the same time. I mean, one of the things I do, I wake up early and I tend to go off for a walk. But actually, it's lovely. No earphones, no digital media, no nothing. Just go for a walk, clear air. And it's lovely. You just kind of organize yourself for the day. And I do that basically 7 days a week, all through the year. I would thoroughly recommend it as kind of zero cost ability, just to have clear thinking time. And sometimes thinking time can be about the square root of nothing. It doesn't have to be some great kind of life's purpose. Sometimes walking along completely neutral is also lovely.
There's lots of science around having the best ideas when you're in the shower or when you're walking, because that's the time where your brain can switch into neutral and have some space to think about things, to play around with some ideas.
It's been said about children, you need to have some periods of enforced boredom. So I've got another number of pet peeves, but one of which is when everybody says, oh, I'm too busy. No, that's just a failure to prioritize. So that's me being pretty blunt.
Yep.
I block out big chunks of time in my diary, which is just nothing. And it's not that I do nothing in the nothing periods. It's just I can determine what I do in those periods rather than it being imposed upon me. I might be working really hard. I might just go and have a cup of tea and sit on the sofa. Doesn't matter. The fact is that you're then in control and you don't feel like you're on this runaway train that's just sort of just zimming along and everything's running past you and you can't focus. Gary Keller wrote a book about blocking out time so that you have these air pockets. You can come up for air, you can think, you can reflect. I was taught years and years ago that if you wanted to write somebody a really stinking email or a letter, you should write it when you're really angry. And then print it out and leave it 24 hours. Sleep on it. And then you can correct the grammar. No. But you then change the tone or the reality. And again on that, and I suppose it's certainly appropriate now, is my default is pick up the phone. I find it a bit frustrating because the default in the world seems to be send an email, but it has no nuance to it. No. It's so easy for people to get the wrong end of the stick.
I was an oddity in my last corporate job because I was known for turning up at people's desks, because if I could walk to them, why would I send them an email?
Correct.
Just
and the other one that's a really cool one, back into the kind of mentoring coaching one, is walking meetings. If you want to have a good chat with somebody, I did a wonderful piece of strategy work in the middle between the two lockdowns. And we went for a walk for an hour. It was just fabulous.
Up until obviously lockdown and tears, I was still every few weeks popping into London and meeting up with our CMO Fiona, and just having some face-to-face time. In fact, actually our whole team hadn't spent any time together face-to-face because we'd created this company in lockdown. Never, not all that one team had met.
If you had told me 12 months ago that I would have hired a number of people without having met them, I had told you were a lunatic. It went really well.
Yeah. There are different ways of doing it. There are different ways of getting a feel for somebody and creating a team that works together and works really well, even if you haven't met. Obviously, talking about lockdown is very hard to avoid the subject, and us continuing in the tiered system, having faced 2 lockdowns so far. I mean, we just mentioned the fact that you've hired a lot of people remotely, but how have you stayed connected to your network and your colleagues? Because you have many different sets of colleagues, obviously. Has there been anything that stood out to you as a really useful tool or a method for keeping communication open when we can't be all together? You mentioned about, picking up the phone more than an email. Is it just that that's helped you, or is there more that's helped you?
Yeah, picking up the phone, a bit like your comment about walking around and asking somebody at the desk. It's very hard to read because you're suddenly pushing yourself into their diary and you kind of don't know what else. And you think somebody's frankly rude, they haven't phoned me back. No, they've been madly busy on something else. Back to my comment about prioritization. Yeah. Actually, what they've done is they just prioritize me out of the loop. No, that's fine. This happens. So, yeah, there tends to be the phone. I mean, I have a networking business, so I suppose at one level, I'm a professional networker. So that's my Lamwick business. We were running forums about every 3 weeks, face-to-face in kind of normal times. We now run those on video conference call. It's a bit different. It's really hard to do a roundtable discussion. So we tend to default to having 2 or 3 speakers, and I chair it and pull that together. So that's one way of connecting with the network. I also pivoted that business to turn it into a digital publishing business. So we put out a quarterly journal, and I do it as a commonplace book. It's idiosyncratic. It's just a whole bunch of stuff I find to be interesting. And back to my comment about reach and range and scope and opportunity, that feeds that. I use LinkedIn a lot. Back to being the nosy and curious one, I'm interested in what other people do. It's actually a fabulous way of connecting with former colleagues who are working overseas, because I work for an Aussie firm in London. I've got a whole bunch of Australian contacts. And actually, that's a pretty good medium of being able to do that. Back to the one about playing forward, that gets to be more lively and interesting if you comment and help and seek to engage with other people's networks rather than trying to get people always to come to you. Kind of be a reasonable human being rather than trying to scoop people up. And yeah, that's probably about it. I mean, we're all a bit constrained. I mean, I think the thing that's really hard is if you don't have a developed network.
Yeah.
So I think those who are seeking to establish themselves, it's much harder. And LinkedIn being but one example, you can kind of, when you look at somebody's profile, it has it's often quite ignored by those people who've been working for somewhere for 15 years. But their argument is, why do I need it? Well, it can actually be a bit of an insurance policy.
Oh, yeah.
I started with LinkedIn years and years and years ago when it first started, because I moved jobs a couple of times and you couldn't take your contact book with you because it was a property of the institution. And for years, actually, I'm so old, kind of the Rolodex boxes of physical business cards, but they date very quickly. Although it takes a certain degree of sort of strength of character to throw them away, because there might be a useful one. So I switched to using LinkedIn effectively as an online address book because it was off the cloud and therefore you were fine. So my advice to anybody who's looking or even thinking about portfolio-like career, have a network. Doesn't matter who it is or how many it is, have a network, because otherwise you fall into the categories shoulda, coulda, didn't. And doing that today from scratch, from your own house in lockdown, is definitely hard. But then how do you do it? Well, people we went to school with, people who live near with you, friends and family, people you like about. I mean, there are some fairly standard levers. It's that bit ain't rocket science. Oh, and I'm so old that I'm in the demographic who quite enjoy looking at rubbish stuff on Facebook. But I think that's got zero value in terms of my own network. I know other people use it for business. Personally, it's just for silliness. But is keeping connected with other people, it's quite neat as well.
Yeah, you do never know where that next connection is going to come from, or that next recommendation, etc., because somebody will see and connect the dot.
Yeah, I mean, I often get the comments, how do you know all these people? As a sort of weird sort of troll under a bridge collecting business cards. Yeah. Well, it goes back to the nosy and the curiosity part, is that if you're interested in other people, if you are minded to be welcoming, then that's how you get to know people. If you're frightfully closed down and head down and never look anybody in the eye and you don't ever offer anything up, you're likely to have quite a small circle of people you know. And that may be fine. But if you want to get into a portfolio career and you want to be out and about, some of those habits are probably going to have to change.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to end on my own nosy and curious question. Given the number of things that you're involved with and you've created, and this might be a hard question, but what venture or role is your favourite?
I don't have favourites.
No. No, not at all. Not one that you really lean towards.
Yeah, no, that's tricky. The reason it's really tricky is I have built this venture studio of lots of different ideas, and they're all connected. So it's a bit like the human body. I mean, kind of which foot do you prefer, your right foot, your left foot? Well, I'm quite fond of both of them. So that's kind of the pushback answer. But I also need to nurture all of them because they are all interdependent. The marketing and creative agency group that we've created, well, largely my two business partners have, but the agencies within that, one of them is doing the digital transformation to build my cyber fintech model. One of the agencies is doing the PR for one of the other businesses. So everything's interleaved. So as soon as you chop out one part, you end up with a lot of kind of unintended consequences, because it's not just that you've lost that bit, but at all the effect that it ripples through. And it's the greatest strength, I suppose, that everything is interrelated. You're not going to get me to pick a favourite. But having said that, there's always a special spot for your firstborn. And the first thing you do, because it, in my case, was Chalker, which started life as a wealth advisory business back in 2011. That was when I did step off the edge and go, okay, so can I do this on my own? In a recession, being made redundant, decent sized mortgage, wife not working, couple of kids in school. Okay, so what do I do now? You're definitely vulnerable at that point. That is kind of the beating heart at the beginning of it. I mean, I still had it and I'm still doing lots of other things, but that's really kind of the nucleus right at the beginning and the middle. Or put it round another way, if I hadn't done that, I probably wouldn't have been able to do the things that came along behind it.
Yeah, and beginnings are really important. We talk a lot about endings, but beginnings are really important. Thank you so much for your time, Ed. It's been so interesting talking to you today, and I can't wait to find out what next.
Great stuff. Thank you very much indeed for having me. I love sharing and helping and being engaged, and terrific. Thank you very much indeed.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ed.